Hello guys, so today I wanted to talk about the way I think about panning and depth in my mix. I've drawn out this little grid and I'm going to just demonstrate to you on this little piece of scrap paper how I think about panning my mix and how I think about creating depth in my mix as well. Alright, so when we talk about panning, we're literally talking about those little pan dials that you have in your software, where you can turn things to all the way to the left, all the way to the right. And I like to think about LCR panning. That means left, center, or RE if you're in England, left, center, right panning, okay? And I actually like to break that up into very far left, which would be over here, very far right, which would be, I suppose, somewhere over here, and then we break that up into halfway either way, okay? So you've got center right here, you've got all the way left, all the way right, halfway left, halfway right, okay? And those, I like to just break it down into those are my 5 options for panning, rather than getting too kind of stuck in putting an instrument slightly to the right or slightly to the left. I only have 5 options to choose from. It seems to kind of ease things up a little bit. And in the past, I've gotten distracted by this idea of really trying to be too particular about my panning. All right, if you're just a bit more definite about what you're doing, you tend to come out with a clearer mix and a clearer panning in your mix. So 5 options there. We have center, far left, far right. We have slightly left and slightly right. All right, that's kind of halfway. Then when we talk about depth, we've got this line going up the middle here. This line, essentially depth is created in a mix by reverb and delay, for the most part, all right? That and volume, all right? So we kind of use those 3 different tools together to create depth in the mix. So if you add more reverb to something, generally that will push it further back in the mix. And if you make something quieter, it'll be further back in the mix. If you kind of do both of those things at the same time, it will be a long way back in the mix. So if you make the instrument very quiet and also turn up the reverb, then it will sound like it's really coming from the back of the room. So that's kind of how we create a bit of depth in certain instruments. And then we essentially, the reason I have this grid is we then look at the instrumentation that might be in a mix, all right? So we could look at drums. I could just literally write drums, or maybe we could actually even do kick. So let's do kick, snare. We could even talk about hi-hats maybe, and toms. So for the kick, we always want the kick to be right up the front, right? Well, this is always 99% of the time, okay? So there's always an exception to the rule. It is, it's an art form, so, it's a very subjective thing. But generally speaking, your kick is always going to be right here up in the front. So let's write kick there. And you don't want to pan your kick over to the left or over to the right. You always want your kick drum, as it's something that's repeated continuously throughout your mix. You want your kick drum to always be nice dead in the center. If for any reason you wanted to double up your kick, you would want to make sure that that is doubled up maybe evenly on the left and right, but it always wants to sound even between the left and right channels. All right, so if you have 1 kick, you want to pan it right in the center. If you have 2 kicks, you probably want to pan 1 all the way over here and 1 all the way over there. You get a wide kick sound, but you want it to be even between the 2 channels. Then you'll have snare, all right, a snare drum again. And there are, of course, exceptions to this rule, all right? Your snare drum, lots of people do that thing where they have 2 recordings of a snare drum, and you put 1 on the left, 1 on the right, and you get this kind of wide sound where things kind of hit you from either side, and you hear this wide sound to your snare drum. But for the most part, snare drums sit right in the center of your mix, all right, and they're nice and up front. So these snare and kick, the snare isn't necessarily behind the kick, they're sort of both up front and both in the center. Then, yeah, we could talk about hi-hats. Hi-hats are something that you can start to look at. Maybe I want the hi-hat to be slightly over to one side. Generally, hi-hats for me, I like to keep them even as well, so I might do something like this. Hi-hat there, and a hi-hat there. Alright, so we're doubling up the hi-hats, and they're on either side of the mix. Alright, not necessarily too wide, They don't. It's not necessarily something that's going to be adding too much width to your mix, but it sometimes can be nice to keep them even and have two different hi-hats playing at the same time, left and right. But again, it's an even thing. So your hi-hats, generally you're going to want to keep either in the center or evenly between the left and right channels. Sometimes you can pan them over, but I to be honest, really don't do that very often. And then you might have cymbals. Cymbal crashes and that sort of thing is definitely something you can start to look at having further out, further afield, all right? So a cymbal crash, you could maybe have way out. I would say something like this, cymbal over here. Excuse my terrible handwriting. I'm trying not to get my whole arm in the frame. All right, cymbal could be over to one side to keep things a little bit interesting. So we've got the kick, the snare up in the front. Then we have the bass, all right? A bass, you never want your bass to be over to one side. It's going to be weirdly distracting. And seeing as a bass guitar or a bass, you know, whether you're using like a double bass maybe, or a bass guitar or a synth bass, generally those bass sounds they're making up so much of the low spectrum of your mix that you don't want to put them over to one side, because you really will get this feeling of your whole mix moving over to one side, either left or right. So you want to keep your bass nicely up front and in the center, all right? Generally, we don't really double up bass guitars or anything like that. You'll have one really nice solid bass sound, and that bass sound should be nice and up front, all right? So not too much reverb on it, nice and loud in the mix, and definitely panned in the center. Another thing we want to look at having in the center is a vocal, all right? Now the vocal could definitely, a lead vocal is what I'm talking about. A lead vocal could definitely be a little bit further back if you wanted it to be. That, again, it's the 99% thing. There are always exceptions. Generally, if we're talking about like a pop vocal, a lead pop vocal needs to be up front as well. All right, so lead, vox, right there, okay? So at the moment, we're looking at all of these right up front and in the center. We have kick, snare, bass, and lead vocal, okay? And we got hi-hats over here. We could split left and right, that's fine. And a cymbal maybe over to one side, all right? So maybe your arrangement has something like that sort of, what do they call it? Like a ride cymbal, where it's kind of hitting the middle of that cymbal for a little bit of rhythm. That could be over to one side, that's fine. And that could be left or right, that's totally your choice. Hi-hats I like to keep even. Lead, vox, bass, snare, kick, all in the center, nice and up front. When we start to look further back, that's further, you know, deeper into the mix. When we add more depth, more reverb, things that are a little bit quieter, that's when we start looking at maybe our acoustic guitars, things that are layered in there to add some depth to the mix. So literally add some depth to the mix. So maybe we're looking at synthesizers. All right, synthesizers could be further back. Acoustic guitars, all right. I love to do this thing with acoustic guitars where they might be more towards the middle of the mix, in speaking depth-wise, okay. So they're not as up front as these instruments, okay. And then what we want to do is we say acoustic guitar over here, maybe it's strumming some chords all the way over to the left, and acoustic guitar over here all the way to the right. All right, and maybe they're both playing a very similar sort of pattern, of a similar chord progression, and we pan one all the way to one side, one all the way to the other side, and when we play them together, you get this big wide effect, all right? But it's not a mono effect. It doesn't sound like it's coming from the middle here. It adds width to your mix, and because acoustic guitars generally, especially if you're strumming, have a lot of that information in the higher end of the frequency spectrum, so you're going to get more of that sort of that sort of trickly, tickly, sort of those frequencies right in the top of the spectrum that will help you to add some width and clarity there. What other things? So we could have, maybe we have like an arpeggiator or something like that, or like a synth. That could be further back. And we could definitely pan things to the middle if we want to. I would advise, if you have any stereo any like stereo sampled instruments, any stereo synthesizers that tend to sort of, maybe they whirl around, they do some of this, you know, you have a synth maybe that you put in the middle, but actually it's got like a stereo pan on it or something like that, so it's kind of doing this throughout your mix. All right, so it's not really sticking in the middle, it's kind of going around the place. You generally, an instrument like that, you'll want to pan right to the center, all right, because that means it's going to, you know, be able to fill that spectrum up in the way you want it to. That's the reason you're using a stereo instrument, all right? So another example of this is maybe you have a really nicely sampled piano, all right? So maybe you have a piano doing the same thing, okay? A sampled piano, and again, as you go high on that piano, it's going to go over to one side. As you go low on that piano, it's going to go over to the other side, okay? And then they're usually not too wide unless you're really going, you know, if you're going right the way up one end of the piano, it might get over here a bit, it might get over there a bit. But you can see here as well, these instruments are right in the middle. Talking depth-wise, they're in the middle, all right? These aren't necessarily right up with the lead vocal, the bass, snare, and the kick. These four instruments are so important, and oftentimes we get a bit scared and we might put the lead vocal a bit too quiet in the mix. We might put the bass a bit too quiet in the mix, all right? You've got to remember that these four, lead vocal, bass, snare, and kick, are the most important in your mix. They're the ones that everyone's listening to, all right? No matter how many interesting layers you put in your song, these are the four instruments that everyone cares about. That's what everyone is listening to when they listen to your mix while they're at the gym or while they're at the club or whatever. They're the lead four things they're listening to: kick, snare, bass, lead vocal. And that snare could easily be a clap or something like that if you're not using a snare. But essentially those parts of your arrangement are so important. And then, you know, what's right here at the back, you know, adding that real sort of background density to your mix. Well, maybe we're looking at more layered instruments, okay? Maybe we're looking at some of your, again, synthesizers, I guess. What else could it be? I mean, maybe there's some beatboxing. Maybe there's some bongo drums, that kind of thing, that are adding a sort of human texture, but they're not that important to your mix, all right? They are important, but they're adding this sort of, this texture that is sort of almost more felt than heard, all right? So you'll if you've seen my videos recently, I was talking about Michael Jackson and Quincy Jones on Thriller, one of the greatest albums of all time. A lot of Michael Jackson's productions, and some of Quincy Jones as well, will have beatboxing in the background. And these like very human elements that you can barely hear when you listen to the mix, but they're right the way back there, and they help to add some sort of human element. And they'll be quiet, and they might have quite a lot of reverb on there, but they're very far back in the mix, all right? So maybe you got beatboxing, maybe you got some percussion back here, okay? And when things are further back, you kind of, as things go further back, you get more of a license to pan things out. So if you kind of think of things doing this as you go back, you get more of a license to do that, you know? And as you use reverb, you'll kind of notice, if you were to solo out your reverb track, I think I've talked before about how to professionally set up your reverb through a send instead of just on individual tracks. You send a certain amount of signal from each of your instruments to a reverb track. And if you listen to that reverb, you'll notice the things that have more reverb on them tend to start getting wider anyway, all right, as you go further back in that virtual room, in that virtual church hall or whatever it is. Things start to sound wider anyway, all right, because of the nature of reverberation. All right, so these things, percussion, beatboxing, could maybe, yeah, they could be further out. They could be over here, they could be over here, all right? You're able to be a bit more artistic when you start getting kind of further back in the mix and push things out to the sides. All right, so you have this sort of feeling of that you've got to make sure, what are you prioritizing when you look at your instrumentation in your mix? What are you prioritizing? You have to prioritize these, all right? And then maybe another thing to prioritize is maybe if you're a guitarist and the song is, you know, predominantly on guitar, it's guitar and vocal, then that guitar would be up here, all right? If you're predominantly a pianist, then that piano might be up here. All right, it might be quite close and up front, okay? And as we talked about with a piano, it's got like a width to it if it's in stereo anyway, all right? So as things go further back in depth, all right, and we add more reverb, we add more maybe delays, they get quieter in the mix, we also get to, while we're doing that, pan things out a bit more drastically as we go back. Okay, so, and anything, you can see things are kind of splitting up here into little triangles. If you think these things, if you're in this triangle here, or this triangle here, when you're panning something, say you panned, let's say for example, what could we do? Like a clap. Say you've panned a clap here, okay? And that's one clap that comes in, maybe it's a significant moment right before your chorus where a clap comes in on one side and it kind of catches your attention. If you're within these triangles here, it's going to catch your attention that these things are panned specifically for a reason. Okay, so if you've panned a clap there, it's up front, in the mix, it's up front, there's not too much reverb on it or anything like that, it's quite up front, and you've panned it over to one side, which means you're really going to notice that that clap is over there to the left. You're really going to hear that it's on the left, all right? But if you were to put that clap in this triangle, back here, say that clap's in the same spot, but it's back in this sort of triangle, as you can see there's a triangle forming there, put that clap here, you're not going to notice that it's so far over to one side so much, because it's part of that width that's being created by the depth, all right? So there's this sort of correlation between your width and depth in your mix, all right? So I hope that wasn't too confusing. There's a lot of scribbling here, but if you have any questions, do leave me a comment, and make sure you leave your thumbs up and subscribe to the channel and all of that if you like hearing more about audio and my process when I'm recording and mixing. I hope this has kind of clarified some things for you. I just thought it would be a bit different to kind of draw things out a little bit for you. And as I said, any questions, throw them in the comments section. And for now, I will see you on the next video. My name's Tim from Audio Tutor. Ciao.